Now, turning to our program, please welcome Carol Alexander Barnes, Managing Partner at KCB Buildings, LLC, to introduce our speaker.
Okay, guys, just prepare yourselves, okay? Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. Oh, good job. It's much better than last week. Okay. Just before we get started, I just learned that Danielle's grandfather was also a Rotarian in London. So I just wanted to share that with all of you. So I'm super excited and pleased to introduce our speaker, Danielle Brian. She is the Executive Director and President of the Project on Government Oversight. Ooh, it moved. It's okay. The Project on Government Oversight began as a small Pentagon watchdog in 1981 to shine the light on wasteful Pentagon spending. In 1993, Danielle took the reins and grew the organization with a staff of 2 and a tiny, tiny budget to 50 staff members and a budget of millions. Under her leadership, and most recently, POGO's work has resulted in major reforms being passed like Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, the Freedom of Information Reform Act, and the Inspectors General Enhancement Act. POGO has also exposed and resolved conflicts of interest at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of the Interior, and the Food and Drug Administration. The list goes on. I mean, Danielle has testified before Congress over 40 times, so she's kind of a big deal. In just a few moments, Danielle is going to discuss how we can bring to life the UN's Sustainable Development Goal of peace, justice, and strong institutions. Central to this goal is the need to substantially reduce corruption in all its forms and to develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels of government. So please join me in giving Danielle Brian a warm Rotary welcome.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure. Thank you to the Rotary Club, to the UN Association of Milwaukee for having me, and a special thanks to Carol, her mother, Annette, who has been such a warm and gracious host, and to their mother and grandmother, Joan, who I had the great pleasure of getting to meet yesterday. And I know you all hold her in your hearts as I do today because she can't be with us today. Today, I'm here to talk about the deep connections between peace, justice, and public trust in government, looking at the broad goals set by the United Nations for sustainable societies and discussing how we can bring them to life. There we go. The Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations are a manifestation of a collective vision for a world that is equitable, sustainable, and harmonious. And I was delighted to learn that the members of the UN Association here helped to participate in the creation of these goals. These 17 goals, encompass basic societal needs from eradicating poverty to ensuring environmental sustainability. Sustainable Development Goal 16 is my personal favorite: peace, justice, and strong institutions. I like the way this goal is formulated because it reminds us these 3 concepts are interdependent. The UN member states outlined 12 targets to measure progress towards this goal, and central to successfully meeting these targets is the need to reduce corruption, as Carol pointed out, in all its forms, and to develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels of government. Strong institutions are the bedrock of any flourishing democracy. Free elections, independent courts, and a merit-based civil service that provides public services are some of the institutions that provide for the common good. So are effective oversight mechanisms to prevent undue influence from skewing public policy to benefit private gain. Unfortunately, When those democratic bedrocks are not fully intact, we start to see the erosion of public trust. And that perception that democracies are no longer seen as responsive to the needs of the people is growing. We are living in a time when much of society, both globally and in the United States, is increasingly turning away from democratic institutions. A recent study of 36,000 respondents in 30 countries found that in the 18 to 35 age bracket, only a little over half believe democracy is preferable to any other form of government. And this is extraordinary to me. Only 56% of the respondents in the United States identified democracy as their preferred form of government. I'm going to pause because that was shocking to me. Frighteningly, this growing cynicism about democracy tracks with another trend emerging around the world. A shift of government systems away from democratic principles towards authoritarianism. This means the world is getting less free. And as you can see from these slides, the number of people living in free environments has steeply declined, with 8 out of 10 people living in a partly free or not free country as of 2021. So how does this happen? Authoritarians gain power and rule through centralizing power. And it is principally through corruption that authoritarians can concentrate power in the hands of a leader or a small elite that does not answer to the people. Kleptocratic regimes weaponize corruption in democracies. We saw it with Russia and Donald Trump in Ukraine. And it is no coincidence that Egypt, a country that is increasingly sliding back to authoritarianism under a president who gained power through a military coup, was allegedly offering bribes to U.S. Senator from New Jersey, Menendez. And here at home, the escalating loss of public trust in U.S. government institutions, and frankly, our democracy, is of urgent concern. But traditional efforts to shore up our democracy haven't been working. Many, many millions of philanthropic and political campaign dollars have been spent trying to persuade the public that the problems are caused by a few bad apples and that all that needs to happen is to elect the other guy, rather than to reform the systems that are critical for democracy. But there is a solution. I'm not just a downer. It hinges on recognizing that the frustration comes from an increasing sense that our politics and our policies are too heavily influenced by special interests and cronyism. Those who have that sense aren't wrong, but many have unfortunately turned to an anti-government and anti-democratic populist message as the answer. The solution, instead, is to reform our government institutions to ensure that public officials are held accountable for their conflicts of interest and that policies are not vulnerable to undue influence by special interests, and to create space for public officials who are genuinely responsive to advancing the common good and not advancing the interests of the powerful few. Rather than trying to persuade the public that they should simply trust in government as it is, we should create a government that is worthy of the public's trust. And that may sound lofty, but there are real and concrete steps that we can take today to start addressing the problem. A fundamental first step is strengthening the accountability measures, the checks and balances that curb abuses of power and ensure our institutions are responsive to the people. Accountability is the antidote to authoritarianism and the elixir of democracy. I really love that sentence, so I'm going to say it again. Accountability is the antidote to authoritarianism and the elixir of democracy. So to strengthen our institutions, POGO and other good government groups are working to reinforce the 6 pillars of accountability in government. These pillars support the administration of public policy and the delivery of public services. They ensure that the citizens can exert effective pressure on government to be responsive. They are whistleblowers who expose wrongdoing, inspectors general who serve as independent watchdogs at each government agency, Congressional Oversight, which provides a check on executive power, transparency, and civil society participation, which ensure that the government answers to the people, independent journalism, which investigates and exposes wrongdoing, and the equal application of the rule of law to the highest levels of government. These pillars are the sentinels of democracy, guarding against the excesses of power that our democratic ethos remains, ensuring that our democratic ethos remains vibrant and robust. And there are many examples that demonstrate how these accountability pillars work, both individually and collectively, to support government effectiveness. Here is just one to show how whistleblowers can identify a problem, an independent press can investigate and publicize a problem, civil society can uplift and demonstrate its scope, and congressional oversight can work to fix it. In 2014, whistleblowers from an Arizona Veterans Administration medical facility worked with investigative journalists to disclose secret waiting lists, where veterans in need of medical care languished for months waiting to be seen. Do some of you remember when that was happening? It was hitting the news a lot back then. It struck us that there were likely other VA facilities in the country that might be suffering from similar problems. So we at POGO partnered with the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America and put out a call to other VA employees to ask if these problems were systemic across the country. In just 1 month, we received an astonishing 800 whistleblower disclosures. We pulled together our findings, which resulted in congressional hearings. As some of you may remember, the Wisconsin delegation became particularly engaged in part because of problems at the Toma VA facility here. The legislative reforms that followed resulted in dramatic improvement in services for veterans. In a 2019 survey of veterans, 74% reported improvements at their local VA, and more than 80% indicated they were satisfied with their VA health care, and more than 90% said they would recommend VA health care to fellow veterans. In helping to build a government responsive to all the people, accountability measures don't only fight cynicism, they can work towards justice like this. But the goal outlined by the UN had 3 components: stronger institutions, justice, and peace. We can see how these pillars of accountability can help fight authoritarianism to work for peace when widening our view to the global scale. When operating properly, accountability mechanisms can not only help refocus our institutions to become more effective at executing their missions, but they can stave off the authoritarian concentration of power. Around the globe, the tides of authoritarianism have been stemmed by the unyielding resilience of strong institutions. The journey of nations like Italy and South Africa is testament to the transformative power of accountability in upholding the rule of law and fostering democratic resilience. The constitutional safeguards, the vigilant watchdog agencies, and the relentless pursuit of justice have demonstrated the potential for success. In Ukraine, as recently as 2014, the military was so riddled by corruption, they were incapable of defending Crimea from the Russian invasion. But in 2019, newly elected President Zelensky implemented anti-corruption, transparency, and accountability laws around military procurement. And those reforms were promoted by civil society organizations. Those reforms are now being given some credit for the extraordinary success of the Ukrainian military against a much, much larger invasion by Russia. It's hard to imagine a better example of how accountability leads to increased effectiveness in government and ultimately protects us from authoritarian leaders. I said before that accountability is the antidote to authoritarianism. But the health of participatory democracy also depends on the active engagement of our civil society, organizations like the Rotary Club, the UN Association, and POGO. And public engagement is that crucible where democracy is shaped and refined. A good example of how you can exercise this as members of the UN Association, or all of you who are interested in the UN, is an example that right now the United States is not paying our dues to the UN. And this is something that we could all be, as citizens and residents of this community, letting our elected leaders know this is something that matters to you. And you could call them up. I know that my colleagues at the UN Association can help you with what you would actually need to say to those elected officials and say, this is something I want you to change. It's not cool that we're not paying our dues. And here's an example of how that ends up working out. In the summer of 2021, we at POGO polled likely voters in Michigan and Ohio. We found that voters in both states saw corruption in government as a very serious problem facing the country. Incredible to me, more serious than any other issue, including climate change or the economy or guns. Promisingly, we also learned that a broad coalition of voters support a host of measures that federal government is considering that would prevent or stop corruption in government. Across state and party lines, a majority of respondents indicated that corruption is not a Democratic or Republican problem, but a systemic problem that needs systemic reforms. And perhaps most importantly, our polling showed that constituents are clearly more motivated to support fixing the problems in government than just being angry at what's broken. This is where active civil society participation comes in. From decades of work towards good government reforms, we know that better support for government watchdogs is a key step toward achieving the reforms these voters told us that they wanted. The most important watchdogs inside the government are those inspectors general that I mentioned, that were one of those pillars. They report to the heads of agencies and directly to Congress when they come across wrongdoing or mismanagement. But reworking our system of offices of inspectors general does not really sound like the kind of accomplishment that pops up on a campaign ad. And for Congress to act, they need to know Americans care. So POGO took several approaches to activating civic engagement in those states: conducting local radio interviews on the issue, encouraging constituents to meet their members of Congress, and helping them to write local op-eds and letters to the editor calling for specific reforms. We were able to demonstrate to our targeted elected officials that their constituents very much do care about making inspectors general more independent and accountable, and better resourced to do their jobs effectively. So after years of relative inaction on the issue, those officials called a hearing on the Inspector General reform and then moved legislation through the committee to the floor for a vote. And by the end of the year, Congress passed and the President signed that essential reform to protect inspectors general, a repair that adds support and strength to a crucial pillar of accountability. Of course, the US is an advanced democracy, and we have a robust system of checks and balances and the rule of law. However, our institutions remain all too vulnerable to abuse. For example, while our federal courts are subject to a code of conduct, that code only applies to the lower courts and does not apply to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. And the ongoing breaking news about people with business before the court giving undisclosed gifts and luxury vacations to a Supreme Court justice demonstrates the harm of not applying the rule of law to the highest levels of government. I like to describe the weaknesses in US accountability as legalized corruption. It is not that we allow people in power to break the law, as much as we've crafted the laws to allow those with political power to evade accountability. My organization, POGO, was established over 40 years ago by whistleblowers in the Pentagon, because that sector is perhaps the least accountable, the military-industrial complex. The outsized influence defense contractors have on defense policy and spending is manifested in many ways, including pork barrel spending, price gouging, and what we call the revolving door between government and defense industry jobs. The UN Sustainable Development Goal 16 lumps together strong institutions free from corruption with peace. That's because corruption and instability are inextricably linked. And as our friends at Transparency International have put it, addressing corruption is essential for the peace, justice, and strong institutions that are necessary for sustainable development. Tackling the pervasive problem of corruption in the defense and security sectors is crucial to achieving this target. One of the most pernicious examples of legalized corruption in the US is the revolving door between government officials and private corporations, and it is particularly prevalent in the defense sector. In 2018, POGO identified 380 instances of high-ranking former Pentagon officials who transitioned from the Pentagon to defense contractors. But what's really important is this chart. 90% of those people, former officials, became registered lobbyists, where the operational skill is influence peddling. It wasn't what they know, it's who they know. That light blue on the chart, those are all the lists down the side are all the companies. Light blue are those who are hired to be lobbyists. So why does this matter? In clashes between industry lobbying and military judgment, the lobbyists all too often win. That was the case with the littoral combat ships, some of which were made here in Wisconsin. Over the years, the Navy spent more than $28 billion on 32 littoral combat ships. And it turns out the investment was not a good one. Many of the ships had to be retired well before the end of their anticipated lifespan, and others required extensive and expensive repair. I want to note that I do not blame the systemic failures that led to this conclusion on the shipbuilder. The responsibility lies with a procurement system that discourages transparency and accountability. When the Chief of Naval Operations announced his intention to retire 9 littoral combat ships earlier this year, he asserted that continuing to rely on those ships would result in a less capable, less lethal, and less ready Navy. But an intense lobbying campaign led by former Navy officials who had gone to work for companies with contracts to support those ships successfully prevented the Navy's retirement of 5 of those ships. And current lobbying restrictions did not prevent this because they only prohibit a very narrow definition of lobbying activities for very senior officials. With the supporters of our civic engagement program, POGO is pushing Congress to enact several additional common sense measures to slow the revolving door between the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex and build a more transparent, accountable, and capable national security policy. Presidents George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden all issued executive orders or standards of conduct at the start of their presidencies addressing these ethics issues for senior officials in their administrations. But sometimes they rescind these orders or they give their officials waivers from those ethics standards so they don't apply to them. It's time for Congress to codify what the public clearly wants and pass a law to make permanent these standards for the government officials. Eventually, that will not only strengthen these institutions, but it will also reduce the economic incentives to destabilize global security. The journey towards a more transparent and accountable defense framework necessitates the closing of existing loopholes and the enactment of comprehensive reforms. It's time for a change where unbiased and transparent and ethical decision-making becomes the norm in defense appropriations. To protect our democracy, we need to attend to our government between elections and not just on election day. And making government institutions more accountable to the public is key to fighting the existential threats our democracy is facing. As we focus on ensuring effective government and engaging the public to participate in its operations, we need to focus on the right solutions. And one powerful way you can help is to participate in POGO's civic engagement program and learn how to engage your elected officials to let them know how important accountable government is to you. We would love to have you. So thank you for your time and your commitment to a more just and peaceful and sustainable world. And I'd love to answer any questions you have, and I can handle if you take more than 30 seconds to ask.
If you have a question for Danielle, you can form a line at the microphone here. And as a reminder, please keep your questions topical.
Thank you for your presentation. Just a question on that 56% figure that we saw for the United States. choosing democracy. Is there a chance that the definition was the issue, like we have a republic versus a democracy? Is there,
Good
in other words,
question.
could that question have been misinterpreted? Because I cannot believe that 56% of any people anywhere in the world wouldn't prefer democracy over something less free.
I will say both. I don't know the answer. That's a great question. It could be that it was, I didn't conduct that study, so I don't know the answer to that. But I also do know that there have been other studies that demonstrate, especially the younger generations in the United States, are not seeing the value of voting and the sort of intrinsic parts of democracy. They're not seeing them as important to them as we expected. So I don't think this is so far off the mark, even if it's true that it may be some of the definitions might have been off.
Thank you for your work. So I just want to let you know that here in Milwaukee, we've used your publication to get a resolution at the county board to ask Congress to reduce military spending.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, it really worked. It was excellent. My question is about whistleblowers and free press. We know how important that is to the role of government. So as you may know, there's important whistleblower and free press issues right before us. Julian Assange, I don't know if you follow that,
Yes.
is in prison, not because he's a whistleblower, but because he published something that was led by a whistleblower about war crimes. I was wondering if Pogo took a position on that or is following that case. And Daniel Hale is another example, in prison right now for leaking information about how drones kill civilians, and that was kept secret. He leaked the information. He's serving prison time for it now. I wonder if you know about these cases and are going to take a role in it.
Yes, thank you. We have already definitely written to the Justice Department a number of times of great concern of the prosecution of Assange, because really what they're going after is a free press in the way that they're approaching that case. The kinds of crimes that they're charging him are beyond the Espionage Act and really into the techniques with which he used to reveal information, which really are sort of central to free press. So we're very alarmed and oppose the government's position on his case. Daniel Hale is a very important case of a whistleblower who was telling the truth. The Espionage Act is often being used against people, and it has been true. It began to be used more frequently under President Obama to go after whistleblowers who are exposing to the public wrongdoing by the government rather than helping foreign countries, which was, of course, the original theory of the Espionage Act. Another name that you didn't mention is Reality Winner. And there's a fabulous documentary that's just come out now by a great director named Sonia Kennebec about her case, also revealing the truth of misconduct by the United States. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Steve Watrous. I'm the president of the United Nations Association of Greater Milwaukee. Great presentation. I love the story in the Milwaukee Journal about those littoral combat ships. And I wonder a couple things on the military programs. Has that expose that you helped create put an end to those ships? Also, Madison is suffering from terrible noise and air pollution from the F-35s, another terribly flawed program, super expensive and questionable effectiveness. And so if you could say something about that, here in Wisconsin, we are getting more and more of these F-35s coming. And lastly, any chance of getting a real audit of the Pentagon?
A real audit of Pentagon. You're reading the press. No, we have not yet had a successful passage of an audit at the Pentagon, so I'll work backwards on those. With the F-35, I do think it's something the community should be greatly concerned about. Other communities are concerned about residential areas having F-35s just because of the noise pollution. We've also been very concerned about its capabilities and its extraordinary cost in terms of whether it's actually what's best for the military and the taxpayers. So there's a lot of problems around the F-35 as well. And on the littoral combat ship, as I mentioned, the Navy themselves said that they didn't want any, they were going to retire them, but it was that lobbying effort that actually prevented the retirement. So the Navy isn't, that was a great example, honestly, of where lobbying interests overruled what the military's actual interests were. And so only half of those that they intended to retire were retired. And while you're at the mic, you might also let the audience know if there's a way that they can reach you if they are interested in pushing their elected officials to encourage the U.S. paying our dues to the UN.
Yeah, as some of you may know, the House of Representatives budget for including things for the United Nations, the regular dues that we paid since the initiation of the United Nations. They've zeroed out that budget. Regular dues are zero at this point, according to the House of Representatives. Our Democratic representatives in Washington are pretty good on the UN. But if any of you live in the suburbs and have Republican representatives in the House, or for that matter in the Senate, if you could call and let them know that funding for the United Nations is really important. Today's a national call-in day for that, so if you feel like doing it today, you'd be part of a national movement. And you can talk to any of our 3 tables of people here for further details if you'd like.
Thank you. And as I gave examples of work that we've done that really does make a difference, reaching out to your members, letting them know you're a constituent and that you vote and that you can talk to your friends about it, really makes a difference. And especially on an issue where they may not have been very public and whether they were taking a position or not, you can persuade them to do the right thing. So thank you.
Good afternoon, Danielle. Thank you so much for educating and gracing our meeting here.
Thank you, sir.
I will give a disclaimer first. I formerly taught at the University of Oklahoma, and one of my colleagues on the faculty there, Anita Hill, was on the law school faculty. And my disclaimer is that I have no respect whatever for Justice Clarence Thomas. And my question is, how are we going to get the Supreme Court of the United States to adopt a system of ethics? And what are your suggestions along those lines?
Thank you for that. And just in the past week, Justice Amy Coney Barrett said she does think that that's a good next step. I do think that what will be important before the code of conduct, and we've actually we've drafted a model code of conduct for the Supreme Court. Before that's implemented, I do think there need to be some investigations. This is an important place for congressional oversight by the Senate Judiciary Committee into what kinds of influence has already taken place, because there's so many examples now of improper relationships by people who have business before the court and currying favor. And frankly, it is not just with Clarence Thomas. We've seen this back with Justice Scalia going on hunting trips. I mean, this is a long-standing problem. And so we need to sort of get to the bottom of how is this kind of influence allowed to happen, and then make sure it doesn't happen anymore. And we're the only democracy in the world, by the way, that has lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. So I think that's something else to think about.
Hi, Danielle.
Hi.
This is Pam, and for many years I lived in California near the Nuclear Weapons Laboratory, Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Weapons Research Lab, and joined the Tri-Valley Communities Against a Radioactive Environment. And as a result, I am now on the board of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. And we're a group of people who live near nuclear weapons production sites and testing sites. And we've been trying to get accountability for the massive amounts of pollution and the damage it's done to the surrounding communities, but also stopping these unnecessary nuclear weapons programs that are going on. We're going to be doubling the amount of nuclear weapons in our nuclear weapons arsenal. We already have enough weapons to destroy the whole world. Could you address this, please?
Thank you so much for all the work your lifetime of work in that space. It's an incredibly important space. And frankly, we've been very involved in working on accountability around the nuclear weapons complex, working with some of your colleagues around Livermore. And I thought a few years ago, all right, we're not going to really have to worry about the recreation of a concept that we need to be building more nuclear weapons. It was more about cleaning up those that we'd already built. But you're absolutely right. We're shockingly now hurtling towards a plan of building 80 new plutonium pits a year. And a lot of that is built on a militarization of our relationship with China. And in the Congress, you're hearing that as a constant refrain that because of that, we need to start increasing our number of weapons. So it's becoming a priority for us again to sort of start challenging the assumptions behind what is a devastation, especially if any of you know people who live, for example, in Washington State around the Hanford site. That is still the largest polluted site in the world, in the country, because of the nuclear weapons that were being built there. So thank you for raising that.
Very briefly, you talked about the fact that you have yet to conduct an audit of the Pentagon.
Yes.
One of the key elements of transparency and accountability is the legislature's power of the purse. And yet, When we look at security and national defense and military spending, there's very little transparency there, especially for the public to then apply pressure to their congressional representatives. Could you talk about that for a little bit?
It's really such an important point, and it is, I think, in part why my organization was created, is that legislators and maybe citizens are more comfortable holding other parts of the government more to account. I don't know that any other part of the executive branch could get away with failing audits year after year and continuing to actually be given more money even than the president asks for repeatedly. So it's sort of a rarefied space that we need to challenge and demand the kind of accountability, because it is not just wasted money, but what are the implications of more money going into the militarization of our policies? So it's got huge implications, and it's something that I encourage all of you to spend more time working on with us.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Whistleblowers are one of the pillars that you put up on the. My understanding is that recently there's been a dispute as to whether what is a whistleblower
Yes.
and whether they're following the proper procedures. Are you aware of that? And is it a factor that you're taking into consideration to address?
Absolutely. I will say that until about 5 years ago, protecting whistleblowers was maybe the most bipartisan issue that there was in Congress. We had from the far left to the far right members of Congress who thought it was a really important pillar of accountability, and they were behind it. And I will say that during the Trump administration in particular, around the time that there was a intelligence community whistleblower who came forward with knowledge of the phone call that then President Trump had with President Zelensky, raising concerns about the illegalities of that. Then it started to become really polarized, and Republicans started to say, well, is that really a whistleblower? This is a person who anonymously went to their inspector general, and that inspector general went to the Congress, exactly the way the system is supposed to work. But in that case, the president fired the inspector general, which is part of why it's important to have protections for IGs. And since then, we now have a case where there are IRS whistleblowers who are coming forward, and Democrats are saying, well, that's not really a whistleblower. And we've been actually challenging the Democrats who are saying that, because a person, just because a person is public or not public, and they might even be wrong, the definition of a whistleblower is if they reasonably believe that they are coming forward with information around wrongdoing, and they go to a protected source, which is a variety of places, including an inspector general, that's a whistleblower. Even if they have a political agenda, that doesn't mean they're wrong. So it is unfortunately now both sides are starting to carve away at what a real whistleblower is for their own political agenda, and that's really a problem. All right, thank you so much.